Okay, to create a gradient, I'm just going to generate an object here in the center. We really need to use two things. But before I do that, I'm going to go to Window, Workspace, and I'm going to use Essentials Classic. You should do the same thing so your window looks exactly the same as mine. Window, Workspace, Essentials Classic. The first thing I'm going to want access to is my color panel, which is up here. So select that, tear it off, collapse the things that I don't want, and then expand it. Now at any time I can collapse it to being an icon, so it's not taking up a lot of room, and then expand it again. Notice the color space is CMYK. You've been tasked to work in grayscale. So we can switch it to grayscale, and notice the cyan, magenta, and yellow disappear, and we're left with black. From 100% black to 0% black. Now, the next thing we're going to want access to is this gradient panel right here. And we're also going to use this tool right here, and that's called the Gradient tool. Now right off the top, you have an option to add the gradient to the fill component of your object, but you can also add gradients to the stroke. So I'm going to add that gradient fill. I just dragged it down there, but I'm also going to add it to the stroke as well. It's difficult to see that unless, of course, I go to my appearance area. I'm just going to make the stroke much thicker so that you can see it. And with that stroke, I can change the way in which it's distributed around the object. So for instance, let's just look at the three different settings. And this is applying the gradient from the start color all the way to the end color in a clockwise direction. That applies the gradient within the stroke. So you can see it starting here, and it's going from left to right. From the start color here, look at this little gradient slider or color swatch. That's our start color, that's our end color. More on that in a moment. But let's look at the different distributions. And then this one, this is distributing it across the stroke. So it almost looks like a frame. Now you notice this thing right here. That's the gradient tool in action. At any point when we've got this tool active, right here, that's the gradient tool, we have the ability to drag and generate. Now I've got to make sure that I've got the fill component active. So notice, stroke, fill. I've got the fill component active, and that allows me to drag that tool and determine where the start color begins and where the end color ends. And I can shorten that, and you notice that there's a very quick transition between the start and the end colors. I just stretch it out again so it goes from one end to the next. This little thing in the center, this diamond, is the midpoint. And this determines where the gradient colors, the beginning and the end, mix at 50-50, right here. So if I stretch it all the way there, it takes a lot longer going from the white to the black, and right here is the point at which it's 50% black. So that's a linear gradient. And you'll notice here that what's happening is mirrored in this area here as well. So I can change the gradient live. I can move these sliders live on the gradient curve. I can move the midpoint slider, and all of these changes are reflected up here. So I can do the same thing here. You'll notice it's doing a live update on that object immediately. So it's two different ways of accomplishing the same thing. Now, that's one type of gradient, linear. The next type is radial. And what I'm doing manually can also be done here. Now you'll notice with the radial gradient, the swatch on the left is the start point, the swatch on the right is your end point, or your highlight and your shadow. It works in a very similar fashion, so we can move this point over here, and that point source of white moves accordingly. We can stretch it out, just like we did with the linear gradient, and we can reestablish where the highlight point is. We can also make it asymmetric. So there are a number of control points here that allow us to make an asymmetric blend. We can also scale it up or down and rotate it. So we've got all those control points available to us. The other thing that we can do is if we click down, it will generate another slider for us. So you'll notice currently there's a slider right here. I just got that by clicking down. And I can make that much darker. All right. We'll highlight that point right there. We'll make it darker. And now I'm going to take this point right here and I'm going to copy it. Option dragging. So I'm holding down the Option key and I'm dragging that to make a copy. So you can see it's starting at white, then it's transitioning to black, or a darker value, then it's transitioning to white again. I can copy that again, hold down the Option key, and so I can create these concentric bands just by doing that. Again, I can Option drag and copy that and continue to make these concentric bands. So that's a linear gradient, and you'll notice the same thing is mirrored up here. To delete these swatches, you simply pull down and they delete. If we click down again, it drops another swatch in, allowing us to recolor it or copy them. So those are the swatches or sliders, and the diamonds are the midpoints at which they mix. And we can shift that left and right anywhere between those two extremes. Now, if you're doing this and you're finding that it's not working as anticipated, you can see that there's a gradient here, and if you're making changes to that gradient and nothing's happening, so you'll notice I'm making changes to this and yet that gradient's not changing, chances are you're actually making changes to the stroke instead of the fill. Oftentimes, when students are getting an unanticipated result, it's because this is active and sitting in the foreground. So remember, you have these swatches to tell Illustrator which component you want to change. So that's creating gradients. And you can see you can almost create like a frame-like look in that case, just by using gradients. The next thing that we're going to look at is creating a compound shape. And there's two main ways that that can happen. Now, I'm just going to reset this. So we've got one shape here. I'm going to take another shape, an ellipse. I'm just going to draw that. And if I select those two objects, and I select this tool right here, the Shape Builder tool, I'm telling Illustrator that I want to do something with these two shapes. If I simply drag across the two shapes, it unites them. Command Z. If I hold down the Option key, it subtracts. So holding down the Option key will subtract components. So this is considered a compound shape. And if you think for a moment, out of very simple shapes, you can start to construct very identifiable objects. So in this case, I'm just starting with a rectangle. Now I'm going to use an ellipse and move this ellipse down just so it lines up here. I'm going to fuse those two together, so I need to select both of them. Now there is another way using Window Pathfinder. This is an older method, but it has a lot more options for shape-on-shape interactions. Just like the Shape Builder tool, I can unite objects together into a single object. I can subtract one shape from the other. Or I can generate the intersection of those two shapes, among other things. So there's quite a number of different shape-on-shape things available to you in the Pathfinder. Unite, or we can do it through the Shape Builder. We simply drag through all the shapes that we want to unite, and they're united in that fashion. Likewise, I'm going to put another rectangle up here. And in this case, you'll notice, while I'm on the Selection tool and I have these two things, I can access some alignment functions. So I want to align these things horizontally so they're perfectly centered. So we can align objects. We can even use this to distribute objects in even distances. So I'm going to take those two and use the Shape Builder, drag through them, and that's united into a shape. There you have what could be a wine bottle. And then, of course, we just put the base in. And I'm going to align the base. And you can see you can start to imply three-dimensionality there. I can select that wine bottle. I'm just going to keep a copy of that and select these two things with the Shape Builder tool and unite that into a shape. And then I could use my gradient, and if I wished, now your composition, of course, has to be in grayscale. I'm just going to switch over to color scheme. And I can drag this color swatch down onto my gradient at any point in time and start to work in color. Just to show you that gradients can be applicable in both color, any color space really. I'm just converting that color slider to a dark green. Now I can apply that same gradient using the gradient tool and apply it across that bottle. Just like that. And again, I could select this and apply the gradient to that as well. And I could select this object right now. I'm going to send this object behind this object. Remember, we looked at the layers panel. That allows us to stack objects in the order that we want them. And I want to make this semi-transparent. So we saw last week we were able to use the appearance panel either here or here or here to set a blend mode, and I'm going to try multiply, and that allows me to see through this. And I can start to construct that reality of that blend. Another thing that we looked at last week was using effects. So once I've got that ellipse selected, we can use the appearance panel and the effects, and I'm just going to add a little blur to that. Preview it. And that's constructed the reality now that we're looking through glass, and there's diffraction in that glass. And so it's really starting to create something very complex out of things that are really simple. And that's the thing you need to keep in mind about Illustrator. The complexity comes from layering one simple thing on top of another simple thing, and eventually you get to something that looks very complex. Did I need to know necessarily how to draw a wine bottle? Not really. I just had to know that if I deconstructed that shape, I knew that I could reconstruct it out of rectangles and circles. And then my next thought in that process was I need to kind of fuse them all together into a single object so that they can all share the same gradient function. Then I needed to build a gradient. And then I needed to layer these things one on top of the other and use a transparency blend mode in order to let one object show through another. And that I was able to mimic the diffraction of light by using a simple blur special effect. Yeah. The Pathfinder? Yeah. If you go into, so the question was, where do you access the Pathfinder function? It's from the window menu. And you would select it there. And again, the software can't read your mind. And so it's very important that you tell it which objects you want to interact with one another. So you do that using the selection tool. select the objects that you wish to have an interaction with, and then either use the Pathfinder function or you use the Shape Builder tool. Just like that. Okay? Are there any other questions on that? Yeah.
How did you merge the two shapes again?
To do the merger, okay, so there's two ways of doing that. If you're using the Shape Builder tool, you simply start here. You see how it highlights? And you'll notice that there's a little plus sign on my cursor. That means we're going to add shapes together. So as I drag, notice how it highlights in red, and as I continue, it's telling me which objects it's going to include in the union. So when I release, it's fused those together.
On my screen, it's only like highlighting one shape, and when I drag it to the next, it doesn't do anything. Like
Well, here's the thing. If you've only got one shape chosen, it's never going to get to that other shape. So the secret is you need to tell it which shapes are going to interact, and you do that by making sure that you've got both of them selected. Once both of those shapes are selected, you should see this sort of thing. Then you can just drag across it, and it fuses them. Any other questions on that? Okay, so your task now is to create a composition, and that composition has to incorporate one of those principles of design. You may find that your composition encompasses two or more principles of design. You might use movement. Your composition might be about balance. The only thing I can recommend is try to keep it as simple as possible. I'm not looking for you to create the next digital Mona Lisa. I just want you to create a composition that shows me you know how to access different functions of stroke, like thickness or dashes or stylized lines, that you know how to create a gradient, that you know how to create basic simple objects, and that you know how to create compound objects out of those simple objects. This sort of thing or this sort of thing. And then finally, that you can arrange those objects with a design in mind. So use a principle of design to put these things together. I'm not looking for you to do a drawing, because chances are you'll get too caught up in the drawing and you won't be thinking about the composition. And once you've got your composition and your principle of design, you need to set the text at the top indicating which principle or principles of design your composition is using. And so if we take a look at the example, you can see there that that's what's being used. You could argue that there's even movement in here, that this is directing the eye this way and this is directing the eye this way. But review that video by Kevin McMahon, and that should help you come to understand what those principles are, and then create your own composition. The final piece, when you're saving, you want to save two files. You always want to save what we call a native file, meaning this is Adobe Illustrator, so we want to save an Illustrator file. And I'm going to call this line value shape, LVS, and I'm just going to save it on the desktop. I'll eventually put that up in my cloud, on a Google Drive or in the OneCloud. So I saved the Illustrator version. Why? Because I can go back to it and make changes if necessary. I can open it and edit it in Illustrator. To submit it for grading, you're going to use File, Export, and you're going to use Save for Web. And you just close this warning window here. And you see the checkerboard pattern? That indicates that this is going to be transparent, and we don't want that. So you'll notice up here where it says transparency, switch that off, and then change the format from GIF to PNG 24. So what it does is it gives you a nice white background. Then you need to click Save, down there, and I'm going to save that on my desktop as well. So let's just take a look. There's the Illustrator version, and there's the PNG version. And just so you see it, the Illustrator file has this kind of blue checked background, like graph paper. And there's the solid PNG. This is the one that you'll drop into Blackboard. But please don't submit that assignment just yet.